Welcome back to, I guess, our third consecutive election talk. There's a reason we all got booked in together. I am the first cartographer in Canadian history to run for the House of Commons. The background picture here will be a familiar sight to anyone who has worked on an election themselves. This is 20,000 leaflets and 500 lawn signs. About 200 of those signs got run over or shredded during the campaign. I have 300 left. They make an interesting conversation piece in my basement. For my day job, when I'm not whining and dining in Ottawa and making government policy, I also sell reference maps. So the 300 election signs are actually sitting right next to 1,700 printed wall maps. So my basement is pretty crowded. But yeah, here's the proof that I am the only cartographer ever since 1867 to appear on a federal ballot in Canada. It's in a government database, so it must be true. And here's the district I ran in. So in Canada, districts have names, they never have numbers. Mine is called Cypress Hills Grasslands, which is kind of a poetic description of two major parks on either end of this district. So here's a nice orange map. I ran for the Orange New Democratic Party. These are the major communities in the district, shaded in by what share of the vote I got. This is, you might have heard that you can use maps to say whatever you want. Here's the actual share of the vote I got in these communities. So this presentation is going to be all about the differences that make Canadian election maps special and require a little bit more, and require different cartographic workflows compared to US election maps. But some things between our two countries aren't different at all. So my district is right next to eastern Montana. It's completely rural. It's very similar to eastern Montana. What happens when a social democrat runs for office in rural eastern Montana? Right. So the four differences I'd like to run through are, I'd like to explain what the parliamentary system of government actually is. I'll have some brief notes about our multi-party system. I'll explain how our data is reported because it's not by county. And I'll talk a little about the issues of making maps in a huge empty country, huger and emptier than even the United States is. So first of all, parliamentary supremacy. I guess this is one of the more benign forms of supremacy that I could be talking about. But unlike the US, but like Britain, and Australia and New Zealand and a bunch of other Anglophone countries. Legal authority in Canada all comes from the legislature. It comes from the House of Commons, which is analogous to the US House of Representatives. So the House of Commons can override anything the Supreme Court does. The House of Commons can change a lot of constitutional matters that in the US require constitutional amendments. The way to think about it is just imagine if Nancy Pelosi could also do everything that Joe Biden can do. I don't know if this is a comforting thought, but everything is concentrated in that one branch of government. And that's actually one of the things that the US Founding Fathers were trying to avoid when they made your much more complicated system of government. So we've all seen a bajillion US election maps. I made this one myself because I drove here and I passed through North Dakota. There's a lot of red on here. There's a little bit of blue. The huge amount of red indicates that red probably won the statewide election here. This is the 2020 presidential results. And we've also seen there's a lot of ink spilled about statewide races, nationwide races, races for governor, races for president. We've seen entire books published about how to visualize the presidential election. What if I told you that none of that mattered? Okay. In Canada, the only thing we have is the House of Commons. Justin Trudeau is not directly elected. He's just the member of Parliament for a little part of Montreal. So unless you live in that part of Montreal, you will never have the opportunity to mark a ballot for Justin Trudeau. He just happens to be the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. So the Prime Minister of Canada, who has all of the powers of the US President plus more, is whoever can win a majority vote in the House of Commons. And so every Canadian election map strictly concerns legislative control, and there are only so many creative ways to do that. Now, the other big difference, that's right, I was running for my country's third party, which is a little more impressive than saying that I ran for the US Green Party, but not always by much. So Canadian federal politics is still dominated by the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, who duke it out in suburbs all over the country. The Social Democratic NDP comes a strong third in almost every federal election. Rounding out the bottom are the nationalist Bloc Québécois, who only run candidates in the province of Quebec. Finally, the Green Party and the People's Party are both fringier, single-issue parties that have really dedicated supporters all over the country. But similar to US minor parties, they have a hard time getting that concentration that allows them to actually win in any particular district in the country. And just like in the US, support for all of these parties varies depending on where you are in the country. Now, something really special, this is just a screen cap of a polling aggregation site that I actually happen to maintain. This is something that very few federal democracies have, but we do. Every Canadian province actually has a different local party system. So most provinces have a provincial Liberal Party and a provincial Conservative Party, but some of them don't. Saskatchewan does not have a functioning Liberal Party. And New Brunswick doesn't really have a functioning New Democratic Party. And in Prince Edward Island, the Green Party is actually the second largest party, forming the official opposition caucus. Furthermore, these local parties are not really affiliated strongly with each other, so for everyone in here who's design-minded, which should be everybody, these political parties all use slightly different Pantone colors, different logo marks, different identity fonts, and so diving into the politics of any Canadian province requires a little more local understanding than you get with the more homogeneous United States. But it's not your fault. Other federal democracies like Germany also have very similar politics between all of their federal subjects. It is just Canada that is weird and hyper-diverse for some reason. So here's some multi-party maps that I made because we have a redistricting process too, and it actually happens a year later than yours does, so it's still ongoing. So this is a multi-party redistricting map I made in Northern Ontario, where all three major national parties actually have strong local bases of support. So in a system like that, redistricting can have really huge implications, even if the process is fair and unbiased, which ours more or less is. Here's another multi-party redistricting map. You can see this is the city of Vancouver, and you can see the different bases for more than two parties here. Again, this is kind of a complicated map, but the one thing that I think it shows fairly well is that in a typical election in Vancouver, only Vancouver Centre and Vancouver Granville are particularly competitive. Finally, third, we have our reporting. So this is really familiar to anyone who's made election maps before. In US elections, the ballots are actually hauled down to the county courthouse, and all the data comes in from those county courthouses on election night. That's a system with some benefits and some drawbacks. In Canada, our elections are actually federally administered, so all the results on election night are reported by district. So the reason you've never seen a county-level map of a Canadian election is because Canadian local government is stupidly complicated, and I only put this slide in my presentation as a reminder not to say anything else about it. So finally, Canada is really big and empty. This is kind of the most normal thing this is the thing that every presentation has to say about the country. I made this nice presentation map to reiterate that most Canadians live in southern Ontario and southern Quebec. So lo and behold, most Canadian elections are decided in southern Ontario and southern Quebec. You can get a sense here that since you're also probably used to looking critically at election maps, these giant red, orange, and teal districts don't actually mean that national politics are a close tie between red, orange, and teal. Those parties just happen to have advantages in far northern regions. So the best comparison in the US is Alaska. Sometimes American election commentators call this rural Alaska, which is not how it's done in Canada, because the word rural kind of implies tractors and cornfields. For that reason, when Canadian commentators discuss the fly-in majority Indigenous far north, it's usually referred to as remote. And actually, my province of Saskatchewan has a separate government ministry for rural affairs and northern affairs. So instead of just balancing urban and rural, Canadian election maps have to balance urban, rural, and remote. This is another interesting thing about the far north is that it is actually completely urbanized. People in the Arctic are totally concentrated into villages, towns, and cities. There is nobody living outside them. So a proportional symbol map like this one, in other areas of the country, those can be an oversimplification, but in the Arctic, a proportional symbol map is actually basically a complete description of what happened in the election, because everyone voting really did live in one of these scattered urban communities. So that's all four. I'd like to briefly go over my favorite election map that I've done. This is a synthesis of a lot of the things that I've discussed, of a lot of the things that I've gone over here. First of all, it's a cartogram, because that's a good way to show this is a good way to show how much action is really happening in southern Ontario and Quebec. Because of the country's geography, a cartogram of Canada looks really weird and messed up. I've tried to help out a little bit by, for instance, including a little Niagara Peninsula. So I find that Ontarians are actually not bad at interpreting this kind of map. But if you only know Ontario as the shape of Ontario on the globe, this is weird. And the other reason I like this cartogram is because it shows, this shows the full popular vote in every district. And in a multi-party system, that's really cool, because a lot of districts are 3- or even 4-way ties, and some of these surprising, strong minor party performances are some of the most interesting stories that are covered on election night. So I sell these as posters, so I encourage you to go to my website and look at it at your leisure and at full resolution. But this is one of the ways that I've come up with to really explore election results in Canada. And of course, I have a sentimental attachment to this map, because if you look really, really close, you can just barely see a tiny splotch of orange. So